50 days ago, a war disrupted the global oil market in a way the world has never seen before. 500 million barrels of crude removed from global supply. That is equivalent to $50 billion in lost oil production. It is the same amount of fuel required to run the world's entire international shipping industry for 4 months. Gone in 50 days. And somewhere inside that crisis, inside the scramble of banks and institutions trying to unwind currency positions, settle oil trade payments, and move JPY, USD, and yuan across borders instantly in a market that has never moved this fast, the traditional correspondent banking system hit a wall. Pre-funded accounts, slow settlement cycles, counterparty delays, a system built for normal conditions trying to handle an abnormal event. And the asset built specifically for this moment, for instant, neutral, low-cost cross-border settlement without pre-funded accounts, is still trading at $1 and change. Here is what makes this genuinely significant. Iran is now accepting yuan for oil payments. That means India, which needs oil and has rupees, cannot pay Iran directly. They need a bridge currency. A neutral asset that converts rupees to the bridge, moves instantly, and converts to yuan on the other side. That is not a theoretical XRP use case. That is a live, ongoing, right-now problem in the second largest oil trading corridor in Asia. And it is running in real time while the correspondent banking system strains under the pressure. And on the exact same day we are recording this breakdown, April 20th, 2026, SBI Remit and Ttorii Bank just went live with XRP-powered remittance corridors to the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia. Japan is not waiting. Japan is ditching SWIFT. So here's the question that the oil crisis forces into focus. XRP was designed for exactly this scenario. Neutral bridge asset. No pre-funded accounts. Settlement in under 5 seconds. Cost measured in fractions of a cent. Already held by SBI, one of Japan's largest financial groups, at institutional scale. If the Iran oil disruption creates the liquidity crunch that some of the most sophisticated macro analysts in this space are projecting, if institutions genuinely need to move massive currency flows instantly, and the correspondent banking system cannot keep up, what does demand for XRP look like when the plumbing breaks? And why is this scenario playing out right now, in real time, while most of the market is still focused on short-term price charts? Welcome to XRP News Flow Signals, where we map the macro events to the settlement mechanics and show you what the data actually implies. No price predictions, no hopium. We read the on-chain data, the geopolitical developments, and the institutional positioning, and we connect the dots before the headlines do. This is not financial advice. Always do your own research. But if you want to understand why April 20th, 2026 may be the most structurally significant date in XRP's adoption history, and why the Iran oil crisis is not a headwind, it is a proof of concept. Stay with me. Let's start with the mechanics of what happens to global currency markets during an oil supply crisis, because most crypto analysis never connects these dots. When oil is disrupted at scale, several things happen simultaneously in financial markets. Currency flows accelerate. Countries that import oil need to pay for it in whatever currency their supplier accepts. Iran accepting yuan means oil-importing nations that previously settled in dollars now need yuan, and they need to acquire that yuan instantly, not over a 2-day settlement cycle. Correspondent banking gets strained. The traditional system for cross-border currency settlements, pre-funded Nostro and Vostro accounts sitting at correspondent banks in each currency zone, requires capital to be locked in advance. Under normal conditions, that locked capital, estimated at $27 trillion globally, is a cost. Under crisis conditions, it becomes a bottleneck. When the flows accelerate faster than the pre-funded accounts can absorb them, settlement delays, counterparty risk, and liquidity crunches follow. Neutral bridge assets become valuable. Any asset that can sit between two currencies, converting rupees to the bridge and the bridge to yuan in seconds, without requiring pre-funded accounts in either currency, becomes structurally indispensable. This is the mechanical description of XRP's on-demand liquidity product, not as a future aspiration, as a deployed, live infrastructure product that Ripple has been running for years. Now connect this to the specific macro analysis that Jake Claver, one of the most rigorous macro-to-crypto analysts in the space, has been publishing. Claver has described what he calls the reverse carry trade scenario. The mechanics. A global liquidity crunch in traditional finance forces banks and institutions to unwind JPY, USD, and other currency positions instantly. Correspondent banking cannot handle the velocity. XRP steps in as the neutral bridge. Demand for available XRP spikes. Exchange reserves, already at 8-year lows, cannot absorb the demand. A vertical price movement follows. The triggering event for that scenario? A major oil supply disruption, creating exactly the kind of instant, massive cross-border settlement demand that breaks the correspondent banking model. Since February 28th, 500 million barrels of crude have been removed from global supply. The disruption has been running for 50 days. The scenario Claver described is not hypothetical. It is in progress. But here's what most analysis of the Iran crisis misses. And it's the single most important piece of context for understanding what SBI's April 20th launch actually means. Because this isn't just about cross-border remittances. It's about which institution in Japan has been preparing for exactly this moment since 2016. And the number attached to their XRP position will stop you cold. April 20th, 2026, today. SBI Remit and Ttorii Bank went live with XRP-powered remittance corridors covering Japan to the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia. This is not a pilot, not a test, not a limited launch. These are live operational payment corridors, real money moving in real time between real accounts across some of the most active remittance lanes in Southeast Asia. Now understand why this specific launch matters beyond the obvious. Rising SWIFT costs, combined with ISO 20022 pressure, the global financial messaging standard updates requiring structured data that SWIFT's legacy infrastructure handles inefficiently, are forcing institutions to make technology decisions they have been deferring for years. ISO 20022 is not a regulation that adds functionality. It is a standard that exposes the cost inefficiency of correspondent banking more visibly than ever before. Every structured data field that ISO 2022 requires represents processing overhead in SWIFT's legacy system. That overhead costs money. And when you have an alternative settlement rail that processes ISO 2022 compliant transactions natively at fractions of a cent in under 5 seconds, the cost comparison becomes impossible to ignore at scale. Japanese institutions have known this comparison for years. SBI Holdings, one of Japan's most powerful financial conglomerates, has been a Ripple partner since 2016. They hold XRP at institutional scale. They built SBI VC Trade specifically for digital asset custody and distribution. April 20th is not SBI making a new bet. It is SBI deploying infrastructure that has been building for a decade, activated at exactly the moment when SWIFT's cost structure and the Iran oil disruption are simultaneously creating maximum demand for an alternative. The timing is not accidental. Institutions do not launch live payment corridors by accident. They launch them when the infrastructure is ready and the market need is undeniable. Both conditions are now true simultaneously. Now you might be thinking, okay, SBI is live, the corridors are real, the macro case exists, but why hasn't the price moved? If this scenario is in motion, shouldn't the market be pricing it? That question has a specific answer, and the ETF data from this week is the signal most people are reading backwards. Let me show you why. Let's talk about the ETF data that dropped this week, because it contains a signal that most analysis is interpreting incorrectly. XRP ETFs recorded $55.3 million in net inflows last week. the strongest weekly performance of 2026. And it happened while XRP's price moved only 8 to 11%. Most retail observers read that as disappointing. Strong inflows with minimal price movement looks like the inflows are not working, like the demand is being absorbed by sellers. Read it the opposite way. When $55 million in institutional ETF inflows produces only an 8 to 11% price move, it means the selling pressure being absorbed was massive. And that selling pressure is finite. Every seller who exits at these levels is a seller who is no longer in the queue. Every token sold to institutional ETF buyers is a token that moves into long-term custody, removed from the tradable float permanently. This is not a sign that the market is weak. It is a sign that a supply wall is being systematically purchased, and the wall is getting thinner with every week of inflows. Now connect this to David Schwartz's statement this week. The CTO of Ripple, the man who architected the XRP ledger, went on record and said, "I hold XRP. If there was some way I could get the price to go up, I assure you that I would do it." That is not a marketing statement. That is a developer telling you that the price does not move through retail enthusiasm or YouTube content. It moved through institutional adoption at scale, and he is building that infrastructure as fast as he can. Circle CEO Jeremy Allaire made the same point from the institutional side this week. The next age of crypto needs to be the age of utility, real use cases that make sense in people's day-to-day lives. The speculation phase is ending. The utility phase is beginning. And when utility drives the market, the 4-year cycle built on retail FOMO waves breaks down. The World Economic Forum projects $867 trillion coming on-chain by 2030. That volume does not arrive in 4-year bursts. It arrives year over year as infrastructure is completed, regulatory clarity is codified, and institutional deployment schedules execute. $55 million per week in ETF inflows, multiplied by 52 weeks, equals $2.86 billion per year removed from circulating supply through ETF custody alone, before accounting for direct institutional holdings, on-chain burns, or the supply absorption from live payment corridors like SBI's April 20th launch. But here's the part that changes the entire supply calculation, and almost nobody is talking about it, because it involves a type of XRP adoption that doesn't show up in cross-border payment statistics. Ripple has been building domestic payment infrastructure in the United States, quietly, through money transmitter licenses filed state by state. And the number of states where Ripple now holds those licenses tells you something about the scale of what they're preparing for. Here is the structural shift that the XRP community has under-indexed on. For years, the XRP narrative was exclusively about cross-border payments, international remittances, bank-to-bank settlement across currency zones. The use case was always framed as the space between countries. That framing is now incomplete. Ripple has been acquiring money transmitter licenses across U.S. states, the regulatory credential required to facilitate domestic payment flows within the United States. Not cross-border, domestic, state-to-state, account-to-account, within the same currency zone. The expansion into domestic payments, projected to be a live use case by 2030, means the total addressable market for XRP is not limited to the $150 trillion annual cross-border flow. It includes the domestic payments infrastructure of the largest consumer economy in the world. When Circle's CEO, the issuer of USDC, one of the most widely used stablecoins in the world, says the next stage of crypto must be utility, he is not speaking abstractly. He is describing the market he is operating in. And the infrastructure that provides utility at scale for stablecoins requires the same settlement layer that XRP provides. Fast, cheap, final. USDC on the XRP ledger, settling through XRP's on-demand liquidity rails, is not a theoretical product. RLUSD already exists. The infrastructure is live. The use case is running. The utility phase does not announce itself. It materializes in transaction data, in ETF inflows, in SBI corridor launches, in domestic license filings, while the market is still arguing about whether the 4-year cycle is intact. The 4-year cycle is a retail construct. The utility phase is an institutional deployment schedule. Those are different timelines, driven by different actors, responding to different signals. And that brings us to the part most people in this space are still underestimating. What happens to XRP price specifically when retail FOMO combines with institutional FOMO and ETF FOMO simultaneously? Because David Schwartz is right that retail alone cannot move XRP. But he also said something that tells you exactly what does. And the number it implies is not what most people are modeling. Let me be precise. Before we get to the demand convergence math, I want to say something directly. What we just mapped. The Iran oil crisis is a live stress test, SBI's April 20th launch, the ETF supply absorption signal, David Schwartz's on-record statement, the domestic license expansion, and the utility phase transition. None of this appears in a single mainstream crypto headline this week. This is the signal layer, and assembling it into a coherent picture, week by week, before the volume data makes it undeniable, is exactly what XRP news flow signals exist to do. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because the demand convergence I'm about to map has a specific trigger, and the moment it fires, the framework we just built is the only context that makes the price move comprehensible. You want to be inside this community before that happens. David Schwartz said it precisely. Retail alone cannot move XRP's price. XRP now trades in billions of dollars of daily volume. Individual retail buyers are statistically irrelevant to price discovery at that scale. But here's what he also implied, and what the convergence of current signals is building toward. Retail FOMO plus institutional FOMO plus ETF FOMO occurring simultaneously. These are 3 distinct demand sources, each operating on a different timeline, each triggered by different events. When they align, when all 3 are buying simultaneously into a supply that has been compressed by 8-year low exchange reserves, continuous ETF custody absorption, and live corridor deployment, the price discovery event is not gradual. Here is the sequence. Institutional FOMO arrives first and is already partially in motion. ETF inflows at $55 million weekly. Goldman Sachs holding XRP ETF positions. Citibank using Ripple's custody infrastructure. The institutional demand is building before the retail community is even paying attention. ETF FOMO follows institutional adoption. As ETF assets under management grow toward $1 billion and then beyond, the product becomes visible in mainstream financial media. Financial advisors start recommending it. Retirement account holders start asking about it. 401k inclusion conversations accelerate. Retail FOMO arrives last. When XRP is on mainstream financial news, when the price is moving in ways that cannot be ignored, when the neighbor who never touched crypto is asking about it. By that time, the supply available at current prices is already significantly smaller than it is today. SBI's live corridors are the institutional signal. The ETF inflows are the ETF signal. The utility phase transition, confirmed this week by Circle's CEO, by the SBI launch, by the Ripple domestic license expansion, is the structural signal. All 3 demand sources are in different phases of activation. All 3 are moving toward the same convergence point. Let's briefly map the broader global context, because the Iran crisis and SBI launch are not isolated events. They are part of a global acceleration. The World Economic Forum projects $867 trillion in assets coming on-chain by 2030, year over year. Not in a single event, not in one cycle. Compounding annually as infrastructure is completed and regulatory clarity is codified. Digital gold tokenization is beginning, still small compared to where it is headed, but directionally confirmed. Central bank digital currency programs are moving from pilot to production across multiple jurisdictions. tokenized securities, tokenized real estate, tokenized commodities. Each asset class that moves on-chain requires the same settlement infrastructure XRP provides. The WEF number is not a crypto prediction. It is an institutional roadmap. And South Korea, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, the corridors SBI just activated are not peripheral markets. They represent hundreds of millions of people currently served by expensive and slow remittance infrastructure. XRP-powered settlement does not replace their financial system. It makes it work at the speed they have always needed. Let me leave you with the frame that connects everything we map today. 50 days ago, Iran disrupted the global oil supply in a way the world had never seen. The correspondent banking system, built for normal conditions, is straining under the settlement velocity that the crisis requires. India needs yuan. Banks need to unwind positions. Currency flows need to move instantly across corridors that the pre-funded account model was not designed to serve. XRP was built for exactly this moment. On the same day, April 20th, SBI Remit and Ttorii Bank went live with XRP-powered corridors covering Japan's most active Southeast Asian remittance lanes. Not in response to the crisis, because the infrastructure was ready and the need was undeniable. The utility phase confirmed by Circle's CEO. The domestic license expansion Ripple has been executing state by state. The $55 million weekly ETF inflows absorbing the supply wall. David Schwartz holding XRP and waiting, along with every holder who has stayed through every noise cycle, for the institutional, ETF, and retail FOMO to converge. The oil crisis is not a headwind for XRP. It is the first live stress test of the exact problem XRP was engineered to solve. And it started 50 days ago. If this structural mapping of the macro crisis to the settlement mechanics to the adoption sequence changed how you see where XRP stands today, subscribe to XRP news flow signals before the next corridor launch lands. We connect the geopolitical events to the on-chain data to the institutional positioning before the mainstream coverage names what we already mapped. Drop one word below, plumbing, if the crisis as proof of concept framing landed for you. Let's see who caught the signal. Stay sharp. The signal does not lie. Not financial advice. Always conduct your own research.